Let us start off with prayer then. Dear Lord, take this time to help educate us on using your resources wisely. Help us to help the kingdom. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. And it is my pleasure today to offer the treasurer of the Pendel annual conference, Bill Westbrook. But before we let Bill speak today, I would like Bill to tell us one interesting fun fact about Bill that no one else knows, or maybe not a lot of people know about. Tell us something.
Well, I think the most fun fact for me would be that I'm probably a second coming of a tinker.
Of a tinker?
Because I like to tear stuff apart and put it back together. And most of the time, I don't have any pieces left over. So I think that's a good thing.
That is awesome. Well, he has graciously given time to put together this presentation for us to help out talking about the parsonages. And we are just so thankful, Bill, for your time and effort today to help educate everybody and make it clear and make it as easy as possible for the process and answer questions about this too. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Bill Westbrook. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Frank. I hope everybody's having a good afternoon. It may seem like selling a parsonage is a fairly simple and easy decision, but actually it's not. And I'd like to share a few questions that you have to keep in the back of your mind. If I can get this thing to go. There we go. So the first question obviously is, why do you want to sell the parsonage? Most of the time it's because you're coming up on some major capital expenditures. Maybe it needs a new roof, new air conditioning, or a heating system, those kinds of things, or just generally the maintenance every year is becoming a problem. A lot of cases you might just have appointed a new pastor and they come to you and tell you that they already own a home and they really don't want the use of the parsonage. So what are you going to do with it? Same situation for if you have a part-time pastor or a lay pastor that's been appointed to your church. They're not required to have housing. So you now have an empty parsonage potentially on your hands. But one of the things you have to keep in mind locally is that you have to maintain the ability to provide a parsonage in the future if a pastor needs one, a new appointment, and the pastor needs a home. So one of the things you got to keep in mind is in your local area, what does the real estate market look like? Are there homes readily available in the area that your church is, such that if you need to make a purchase of a new parsonage in the future, there's something available? Or if you're going to continue with a housing allowance, can the pastor coming in buy a house and sell a house fairly easily in that local area? Or are there rental options available for that pastor in the local area? I mean, all of that is a very difficult consideration because markets change from year to year, but you should be able to be the best judge of what's happening, whether the real estate market is active, whether it's going to be more active in the future or less active in the future. And all of that needs to come into play as to whether you actually get out of the parsonage ownership business. The third and big one, I think, for our churches is, do you have an expectation that your pastor is going to live in the community? Because if you're providing a housing allowance, there's no guarantee that your pastor is going to purchase a house in the local area. And if you just received a pastor, it's not likely that that pastor actually lives in the local community. So they may have a commute to get to events and activities within the community itself. So if you want to guarantee that that pastor is going to be living in your community, the only way to do that is to provide a parsonage. Once you've determined whether you want to get rid of that parsonage or you're not using the parsonage, then you come down to a decision of, do I actually sell it or do I rent it while it's not being in use. And some of the pros and cons on each side. If you're selling the parsonage, obviously those capital expenditures and the maintenance, ongoing maintenance costs, they would go away. There would be a lower cost in insurance because obviously the property is not being insured now. And of course, the SPRC and the trustees would get out of at least an annual inspection of the parsonage property. But the cons on it are that you still must maintain the capacity to provide a parsonage in the future. And then you would, instead of providing a parsonage, you would have to provide a housing allowance. And then there's no, as I said, no assurance that the pastor is going to be actually living within the local community. Now, when you're looking at the housing allowance situation, the conference does not have any set guidelines for a minimum housing allowance, except for an old task force suggestion that the housing allowance should be no lower than 20% of the pastor's salary. Unfortunately, as the real estate markets have increased over the years, that 20% is probably not going to provide a house in the area. The true way to determine what the housing allowance should be would be to inquire from a local real estate agent of what would the fair rental value be of a furnished home with utilities in your local area. And then obviously the cost of that rental would then be equated to a housing allowance for the pastor. Now in renting, the pros with renting is the rental income can be fully used to offset the housing allowance. And it can be used as a parsonage in the future if needed. So you're not giving up the ownership of the property. And the cons on that one is you obviously, if it's got capital needs, you're going to continue to have to provide capital needs as well as maintenance and insurance on the property. And since it's no longer being used as a parsonage, it's now going to be subject to local property taxes. So you would have to inform, and in a lot of cases, I know in the city of Dover, that if you're going to rent a property, you have to actually have a rental permit. And they require periodic inspections to make sure that everything is up to code. So they will find out one way or the other that it's no longer a parsonage and you will be subject to property taxes. Then the third item is that it may actually be subject to what's called unrelated business income tax, in which you have to file a Form 990T. Now this comes into play most often if your parsonage is actually mortgaged. If there's a mortgage on the parsonage, then any rental income would be subject to the unrelated business income tax. If there is no mortgage on the property, the way the IRS treats the rental income is they treat it as an excess asset. But even though it's not being used for its current religious purposes, it's maintaining that as an investment to be able to reuse it or repurpose it for religious purposes in the future. And therefore, they do not treat that as unrelated business income in most cases, other than if it's mortgaged at the time of the rental. So if you decide to sell the property, there are several paragraphs in the Book of Discipline that cover the sale of church property. And I have the 4 listed on the screen now. The first 2, 2540 and 2541, basically have the same language. The only difference is whether your church is an associate structure or an unincorporated organization, or it's incorporated. That's the only difference, but the language, in a few minutes, you'll see the language is exactly the same. 2542 is the disposition and mortgage of church property and parsonages. And 2543 sets the restrictions on the proceeds from either a mortgage or a sale. And we'll briefly touch on each one of those paragraphs. In 2540, 2541, the process first starts with notifying your district superintendent, and that sets the process of a review date for your district board of church locations, and you have to set a date for the charge or church conference. Just to make sure people understand the difference between a charge and a church conference, if you're the only church on your charge, you will always have a church conference unless it's a very controversial issue in which you can ask for, and 10% of your congregants can ask for a church conference, which basically gives everybody who's a professing member of your church a say-so in the decision. The reason they word it this way is because if you're a multi-point charge, so if you have 2 or more churches, and only one church owns that parsonage, that church would need to conduct a church conference as opposed to a charge conference. Because in the charge conference, the other 2 churches on the charge would have an opportunity to weigh in on the decision. So if you're in a multi-point charge and one of those churches owns the parsonage, that particular church would need to conduct a charge conference. Once that conference is established, then the church is going to provide 10 days notice prior to the schedule, at least 10 days notice prior to the charge or church conference. And that can be made from the pulpit and then from one other source of communications, whether it be your newsletter, whether it be the bulletin of that day that you provide, or whether it be through an email notice or some kind of an online electronic notification. But it has to take 2 forms in order for it to be disciplinary legal. Then it also provides that the Board of Trustees are then duly authorized to sign any documents to consummate the transfer of deeds and consummate the sale. And those signatures by those trustees are binding upon the local church. 2542 is the disposition of buildings and property. And it basically says that the district superintendent represents the annual conference, and the district superintendent, by virtue of having it reviewed by the board of church location on the district, gives their consent to have the trust clause released from the parsonage property. Just a brief understanding of the trust clause. The Board of Trustees for a local church owns the property, and it's deeded in the name of the local church, as is the parsonage. But the discipline requires certain language in that deed that says that the property is under trust for the benefit of the United Methodist denomination. And the annual conference is the representative for the denomination in terms of property and that trust clause. So locally, the Board of Trustees have authority over the property as long as they are maintaining it as United Methodist property and are using it for the benefit of the United Methodist Church. If that ceases to happen, then the trust clause kicks in, and the property then is under the auspices of the Conference Board of Trustees, and then they would take whatever action is necessary, whether they would provide it for a new church start, or whether that would be sold to another congregation, or whatever would needed for that disposition. But it's the district superintendent who represents the annual conference, and at the time you go to settlement, they must sign off on the release of the trust clause in order for title to be given to the new owners. If that's not the case, then they do not have clear title to the property. And then on the restrictions of the proceeds of mortgage or sale, I think probably most people have heard that it cannot be used for current operating expenses, and that includes providing the housing allowance. And it can be used for capital improvements, but only if adequate provisions have been made to make sure that the housing needs of the pastor are being able to be met by current income, and it requires the consent of the district superintendent and the pastor before it can be used for capital improvements. The third and fourth items are somewhat more restrictive. It can be used for aiding in the construction of a new church, but that whole process again has to go through the Board of Church and Location. So they will certainly make sure that the housing provisions of the pastor are accounted for. And then the most restrictive is it can be used for congregational development or redevelopment of that church, as long as you have a 3 to 5 year plan, and that plan is presented to the annual conference and the annual conference accepts that plan. So it's a more cumbersome process, but it could be used for those purposes. One of the things I did want to go back to in terms of the not being able to use for current operating expenses. When we talk about the proceeds, what we're talking about is the original corpus of dollars that's received at settlement. That becomes the principal, and that's the part that's not able to be used for operating expenses. But if you do then invest that principal, any income that's earned is available to provide for the housing allowance. So you need to have that distinction that the proceeds become the principal, and then anything above that then is usable for a housing allowance. So what you need to do as a local church, once you've decided to sell, is actually develop a sales plan. The question is, do you know what the value of that property is? Or do you need to have an official appraisal done for marketing purposes? Will you list the property yourselves or hire a broker and pay a fee to sell the property? Will you make any necessary repairs or sell as is? I can give you an example. When our conference board of trustees went to sell a district superintendent parsonage, we thought that we were saving the conference money because we didn't want to do all the major repairs on the parsonage. But when we took it to market to sell, guess what happened? The market price fell to almost exactly what we calculated to be the capital expenditures needed to bring the parsonage back up to proper standards. So in the end, whether we sold it or whether we invested in it, turned out to be a wash. So take those things into consideration when you're looking at just selling the property. Because if you're selling it as is, it will definitely affect the marketability of that property, how fast it goes and what it sells for. And then also what members of the trustees are going to be involved in receiving and communicating the offers for sale to the Board of Trustees. You only want one or just a couple of contacts to have that broker or have it listing and have offers coming to rather than the full board. And then, because you could possibly get multiple offers, but you have to understand what the offer says and translate that to the full board so that they can make a decision on whether to accept the offer or not accept the offer, or even make a counter offer if they so choose to do so. So all those things should be set up before you start the sales. In fact, you probably should have that in place before you even go before the District Board of Church Location, because all the questions at the beginning that I went through and probably this sales plan question will come up, and you need to have the answers for that district board to satisfy their curiosity to make sure that you've done your due diligence in deciding to sell your property. Once you've sold and went to settlement, you're going to get those proceeds, but hopefully your Board of Trustees has already developed an investment plan. If they haven't, then you would need to provide for how those proceeds are going to be invested. And that's to maximize the return to be able to support the housing allowance that you now have to provide. It's a formalized investment policy that talks about what kind of investments you can invest in, what kind of risk you want to take. Obviously, you want to be more than just certificates of deposit, because you're not going to make enough return on a certificate of deposit to come near what the housing allowance is going to be for that pastor. So you're going to have a mixture of stocks and bonds. So you'll need to have a formalized policy to determine how much goes where. And then will that investment be handled in-house, or will you have an independent manager? And one of the things that the foundation does, that Jack Brooks and Frank and Annabelle and Tracy represent, is they help local churches in the management of investments. And in fact, if you don't have an investment policy, they'd be more than happy to assist you in developing that policy. And I don't know whether Jack or Frank has a contact information they'd like to share, or the website.
Annabelle, can you send that out? Yeah.
Yes, I'll put the website link into the chat.
Okay. And are there any questions that have come up?
So one general question, Bill, is, in your experience, what have been the most common problems that arise around the issue of selling parsonage?
Around selling it? I think the biggest problem is most people nowadays will have a housing inspection done. And during that housing inspection, they'll find some things that the Board of Trustees and the SPRC representatives didn't even think to look at, which again, if you're selling on an as-is basis, that's going to affect the marketability. And it could substantially affect what capital expenditures you would have to do to satisfy the buyer. Because even though you sell it as is, most buyers want it to be able to be moved in and almost ready. So if you have major repairs that have to take place, you're going to take a big hit on the market value.
I got a question.
And then a question for Jack along the same lines. What are the problems that you've encountered with investing the funds from selling the parsonage?
Well, I think Bill touched on it. A lot of churches think about the action, but they don't think about the anticipation of going forward. And that plan, so often we see no investment policy. They think it's church money and we've got to be the most conservative, or put it in a coffee can underneath tombstone number 23 and hide the money. But unfortunately, like Bill said, you need to generate a reasonable amount of income if this is going to help offset the housing, or in the event that you have to buy another parsonage in the future. And so what we do most often is working with a church around investment policies, regarding how are you going to invest these funds to generate what you need. And often going with another investment firm or something, they don't know a parsonage account from an operating account from a cemetery or an interest-bearing account. So it really does take a little bit of a specialization, not only for today, but you sell your parsonage in 5 years from now, there's a new committee or group in that church. As it turns over, you need somebody to continually guide that process and watch that money every day. And many church folks they set it and forget it, but the markets need a little bit more attention, as we've seen this volatile year. So I think that this is where having a plan, but more importantly, helping to be executing that plan in a periodic way is what helps maintain the best outcome for everybody that's involved. And that is however the funds may be set aside or utilized. Also for those repairs. You know, sometimes it's church has deferred maintenance, and the sale of the parsonage is going to help offset maybe the maintenance and stuff that Bill had talked about. But it helps to have a plan on how you're going to be able to do all those projects over a period of time, and look at what that value is and how do you get that done. It really is about the execution and having a guidance for that. Policies, procedures, and then a guidance to fulfillment is it's ongoing. I think, Bill, you've seen that as well, right? That it happens and then it goes, and then there's a need and everybody's scrambling to figure out what happened.
Right. I think one of the other things that I would chime in on is in the investment plan, you have to determine whether you want to actually use all of the return that's processed in a year, and just keep the principal at the level it was when you sold the property. Well, if you need to purchase a parsonage 10 years from now, what you're going to have to spend to purchase that parsonage is not going to be the same on what you received in the sale today. So you have to also in that plan figure out how you want to and how quickly you want to increase that principal amount to be able to provide for a parsonage in the future if it was necessary to do so. So don't think of it as just, well, I can spend everything that I earned on it, and all I have to do is keep the proceeds in that account, and I'm good, because it's not gonna cover the cost of a parsonage in the future.
Good point. Yeah, and Bill, I know you were talking about selling. What about renting? What are the major issues, or has there been a common theme of problems you've had to deal with when they tried to rent the parsonage?
Not so much. Okay. I mean, in terms of rental, the thing that you have to worry about is you get a bad tenant. Okay. So you could have a possibility that they're not paying the rent. I've seen that in a couple situations, or they don't take pride in the parsonage or the house itself. And then when the lease is up, you've got extensive repairs that have to be made as a result of them not taking care of the property as they should. Those are probably the two major items with rentals. But if you can screen the persons coming in, I've seen a few occasions where churches will rent a parsonage at a lower than normal rental, but then the person acts as a sexton at the church. They cut the grass and they do maintenance around the church and things like that. So it's kind of a win-win for both. It helps the person out with a little bit lower rent, but it also helps the church out with not having to spend money on a outside contractor or hire somebody to do some of that work. So,
also, Bill, we had one recently in another annual conference, Bill, and it was about they rented the parsonage, but it was accessibility to inspect that because there were insurances that had to be covered. It's a rental kind of a unit that may not include the person renting the unit's insurance. And it was just about making sure that it was being kept up and written into the rental agreement that the landlord, in this case the church, could go in and have access within a reasonable amount of time for inspection. And it was holding up their insurance renewal and a variety of other things. And then, of course, there was a reason why the tenant didn't want the landlord in. And so these things become unintended consequences. It is part of that plan.
Right.
We do have another question I think Annabelle will get to that was asked about
Yeah, so somebody's just asking for clarity. I'm just going to read this and see if this is exactly what you are trying to convey, Bill. It says, for clarity, the funds received from the rental of the parsonage do not go to the church's budget nor to the trustees' budget. It should be invested to best meet the future needs to supplement a pastor's housing with the interest earned on the principal, the repair of the existing parsonage, or a future purchase of a new parsonage.
Now, in the case of a rental, the rental can be used for offsetting the cost of the housing allowance, which is a current operating expense. But now the question you would want to have is, do you set the rental agreement or rental amount at a sufficient level that there is part of that that is set aside for future repairs for the parsonage, which will need to take place. So you could have two components: the part that offsets the housing allowance as part of the current operating expenses, and another part that is then invested for the purpose of doing repairs in the future on the parsonage. So you could have both.
Okay. That's all the questions at the moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, panel. Really appreciate Bill taking the time to make this clear. It can be very complex, but it's a very impactful financial impact on our churches. So thank you so much for the time to put it together for us and share with us. And as I said, we'll have it on our website, Mid-Atlantic Foundation.org. You'll see it on there. I think, and it has our phone numbers and contact numbers there too. And thanks, Jack and Tracy, Annabelle, and particularly you, Bill, and all our pastors for taking the time out today to learn a little bit more. And we just thank you all for what you're doing on the front lines. But thanks, Bill, once again. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to just leave everybody with this thought, and that is, if you're even thinking about selling a parsonage, get in contact with your district superintendent right up front.
Good. That's great. All right. Well, thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Oh, wait, one question coming up.
Okay.
Great. So the question, Bill, is that the person in question has a parsonage that is uninhabitable. How do they proceed with that?
Well, I guess I would have to break that down and ask, is it uninhabitable to the point where it's condemned, or is it just not in the best of shape and needs a lot of repair? If it's been condemned, you might as well just knock it down and either rebuild from scratch or just sell the empty lot. But if it's salvageable, you're just going to have to invest in the infrastructure to bring it up to code in order to use it as a parsonage, because you won't even be able to rent it if it's uninhabitable. So you just have to make the decision: am I investing money in it, or am I simply just going to tear it down and sell the property for the value of the property and go forward?
Okay, thanks. And then one other question: can the rent cover the pastor's allowance completely?
It theoretically can. It depends on the local market. Obviously, if you're trying to rent it at a price that's higher than what anybody else can be rented for, you're not going to have a tenant. But theoretically, yes, it could be rented for enough to cover the full allowance.
Thanks, Bill, again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.